Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the first webinar in our two-part Vote for Kids webinar series. My name is Garrett Smith, and I'm with the Children's Environmental Health Network, or CEHN, and I'll be serving as today's moderator. Thank you all for joining us. This is an important conversation about one of the pillars of our democracy, and especially about how voters can center children's health when evaluating the various candidates, policies, and priorities that are present in our upcoming midterm elections. Before we begin, I'd briefly like to introduce CHN and explain why we, at the direction of Deputy Director Christy Truesdale, developed these Vote for Kids resources. CHN is a national nonprofit organization dedicated to protecting children from environmental health hazards and promoting healthier environments where all children can live, learn, and grow. Our work brings together public health professionals, researchers, advocates, families, and community leaders to advance high-level policies that place children's interests at the forefront. Children, as we all know, are affected disproportionately by decisions involving air quality, toxic chemicals, industry practices, public infrastructure, and access to a healthy democracy. However, because they can't vote or participate directly in said democracy, many of the decisions that shape their health and futures, they don't even have a say in. So we as adults have an important responsibility to step in and consider them when voting and engaging in the democratic process. That tenet is the foundation of our Vote for Kids voter guide and toolkit resource. Finally, I just want to mention to all of our viewers that these resources are entirely nonpartisan. CEHN does not endorse or oppose political parties or candidates. Now let's get started. Today, we'll focus on four areas included in the guide: democracy, clean air, a toxic-free economy, and safer industry practices. Our speakers will explain what each of these priorities mean, why it matters for children, family, and communities, and what voters can consider when evaluating their candidates. Following the presentation, we'll have a moderated Q&A session, and then I'll walk through the voter guide toolkit and discuss how you can take that toolkit into your communities and share the resources. Finally, a few housekeeping notes before I go ahead and introduce our wonderful speakers. Today's webinar is being recorded. The recording and the related resources will be shared with everyone following the event. At any time, you can use the Q&A feature to submit any questions you may have, and we'll address as many as time allows at the end of our presentation. Finally, there's also a chat feature at the bottom of your screen if you'd like to go ahead and introduce yourself and the organization or community that you're joining on behalf of. All right. We're grateful today to be joined by four fantastic speakers with extensive experience in children's environmental health, civil rights, and public policy. First, we have Dr. Ann Mellinger-Birdsong of Mothers and Others for Clean Air. Dr. Mellinger-Birdsong will discuss what it means to vote for clean air and why strong air quality protections are essential for children's health and development. We're also joined by Mike Schade of Toxic Free Future. Mike will discuss the importance of building a toxic-free economy and how our decisions about chemicals, productions, and public policy affect children in our communities. Our fourth speaker is Abre Conner of the NAACP. Abre will discuss safer industry practices, including why corporate accountability and strong public protections are important for communities that face a disproportionate burden of pollution and environmental hazards. Finally, I'm pleased to introduce Nsedu Witherspoon, Executive Director of CEHN. Nse has led our efforts to protect children from environmental hazards and ensure that children's health is represented in public policy. She'll begin today's presentations by discussing democracy and the connection between civic participation, public decision-making, and children's health. Nse and all of our speakers, thank you for joining us. I'll now turn it over to you to discuss what we mean when we say vote for democracy.
Thank you so much, Garrett. Thank you so much, everyone, Christy, Hannah, the entire CHN team, and all of our wonderful leaders, partners, and of course, our advocate champions who are joining us today and will be listening to this recording. Children are certainly a key factor in a democracy, in case anyone was questioning. They're just a few of our leaders. There's so many that I could also depict that have, over the time of their tenure in leadership in our history, called out that very fact. President John F. Kennedy, children are the world's most valuable resource and its best hope for the future. This reflects the democratic belief that investing in children's potential benefits society as a whole. Kofi Annan, there is no trust more sacred than the one which holds with children, the world that holds its children. There is no duty more important than ensuring that their rights are respected. that their welfare is protected and their lives are free from fear and want, and that they can grow up in peace. This underscores the global democratic commitment to safeguarding children's rights. And finally, this Shenandoah proverb: it is no longer good enough to cry peace. We must act peace, and live in peace. Next slide, please. There are generally key pillars of democracy. The main pillars of democracy include the legislature. The legislature is responsible for making laws. It represents the will of the people and is essential for ensuring that the government reflects the interests of all of its residents. In many democracies, this body consists of two houses, for example, the House of Representatives and the Senate in the United States, that debate and pass legislation. The other pillar, number two, is the executive branch, which implements and enforces the laws created by the legislature. It is headed by the president or a prime minister and includes various government agencies. This branch is responsible for the day-to-day administration of the government and ensuring that laws are executed effectively. The third is the judiciary. The judiciary interprets the laws and ensures that justice is served. It acts as a check on powers of the legislature and the executive, safeguarding individual rights and upholding the rules of law. An independent judiciary is crucial and vital for maintaining fairness and preventing abuses of power. The fourth is the media. The media serves as the fourth pillar of a democratic society by providing information to the public, by facilitating informed decision-making, and holding the government accountable. A free and independent press is vital for ensuring transparency and fostering public debate. There are additional principles that support an effective democracy. For example, free and fair elections. Regular elections allow citizens to choose their representatives and express their political preferences. This is fundamental to the democratic process, ensuring that the government remains accountable to all the people. And next is rule of law. This principle ensures that all individuals, including government officials, are subject to the law. It protects citizens' rights and prevents arbitrary governance. Protection of human rights is a final pillar. Democracies must safeguard individual liberties and rights, ensuring that all citizens can participate fully in the political process without fear of discrimination or repression. These pillars and principles work together to create a robust framework for democratic governance, ensuring that power is exercised responsibly and that the rights of all are protected. Next slide, please. A democracy that truly centers the needs of all children must integrate child-centered values into its institutions, policies, and practices. I don't think I need to tell anyone here, but just to make sure we're all on the same footing, children have unique experiences by the surroundings that influence their health and development, the air, the water, the food that they come in contact with, the consumer products that they interact with daily, the furnishings, the building materials, and the spaces and natural environments that they spend the most time in, all have an impact and, quite frankly, all test the effectiveness of our true democracy. Climate change is also a threat multiplier. Next slide, please. So why does voting for children's environmental health matter? From 2011, for example, to 2023, the prevalence of 3 to 17-year-old individuals with a chronic condition rose from almost 40% to over 45%. 81% of Americans do believe that the burden of pollution is being shifted onto themselves and their families through their medical bills and their short to long-term health consequences. And there's large bipartisan majorities that are concerned about toxic chemicals and harmful pollution in their drinking water, their food, consumer products, and the air that they breathe. Next slide, please. So we, through this tool, the Vote for Kids voter guide, we are encouraging us all to encourage individual voters and campaigns to vote for democracy as one of a few child health-centered pillars when it comes to exploring which candidates to choose. Our country was founded on these democratic ideals. We must uphold the constitutional concepts. So we want to encourage looking for candidates who support voter protections, upholding the constitutional checks and balances of power that represent, engage, and uplift civil society, and aim to make government actions and processes more transparent. Next slide, please. Drawing from democratic education theory, equity, advocacy, and civil engagement frameworks, several core aspects are essential to reimagine a democracy that truly is for and with children at the center of all decision making. Early childhood as a democratic right. Every child, regardless of zip code, income, or background, should have access to high quality, affordable learning. This includes safer, nurtured environments, skilled educators, and inclusive curricula that prepare children for active citizenship, and that's from defending the early years. Safety, belonging, and emotional well being. Children must feel accepted and valued as members of their communities. Safe environments that allow expression of emotions without harm, and secure relationships with caring adults, and foundational to healthy democratic participation. That's from our partners, the National Association for the Education of Young Children. They also have reminded us that democratic life skills are vital from childhood. From an early age, children should develop skills such as problem solving, ethical decision making, cooperation, and respect for differences. It all starts at the earliest years. These skills are best nurtured in developmentally appropriate, relationship-based classrooms that model democratic values. 4, inclusion, equity, and diversity. A democracy must recognize and include all children's identities, racial, ethnic, cultural, ability, and social economic value systems. Equity ensures that resources and opportunities are distributed fairly, addressing disparities that hinder participation. And that's from the National Civic League. Empowered and informed citizens. Children must be protected, informed, and engaged in decisions that affect them. This includes access to accurate information, trusted communication channels, and opportunities to voice concerns in school and community settings. And that's from the Impact Program at University of Penn. Responsive and participatory guidance. As Garrett rightly introduced, the Children's Rights International Network reminds us that despite under 18-year-olds representing a third of the world's population, most children continue to have no direct say in the rules and the laws that govern their lives. This exclusion endures across democratic and authoritarian states alike, despite the recognition that international laws that children are rights holders and have the right to say on matters that affect them. Many children feel this accurately and they are accessing their civil and political rights by leading protests, demonstrations, community mobilization, and accessing justice through the courts. Children are not passive consumers of our political systems, but rather active citizens involved in shaping the world around us and our collective futures. Their participation and partnership is vital to a functioning democracy. For the youngest of our children, it is up to the rest of us to uphold the democratic pillars as we work to center their needs and their rights. Local and national policies should be shaped by inclusive listening and collaboration with children, families, and communities. Children's voices should be integrated into decision-making at all levels, from education, policy, to public safety. Number 6, strong civic education and democratic culture. Education systems should be embodied in democratic values such as justice, fairness, and collective responsibility. Into curricula, aside practical skills for civic engagement. We need to be supporting educators and community partners. High quality early childhood education and K-12 schools depend on well-prepared, supported teachers. And I would add healthy and safe teaching force and strong family-school partnerships. This includes ongoing professional development, fair pay, and resources. Next slide, please. In practice, a democracy centered on children's needs will combine safe, inclusive housing, early and K-12 learning, equitable access to opportunities, democratic life skills development, and active civic participation from the earliest of a child's years. This approach not only benefits children, but strengthens the resilience and fairness of a true democratic system as a whole. Thank you so much, Garrett. I will pass on to you.
Thank you so much, Nse, for grounding today's conversation in the importance of a healthy democracy. As you, a lot of the decisions that impact children's mental health are actually shaped their families and their communities and the voting abilities and patterns that they demonstrate. So it's very much an important time to turn and examine these factors. We're now going to actually turn and view one of the most immediate environmental factors affecting children's environmental health, and that's the air they breathe. Dr. Ann Mellinger-Birdsong is going to go ahead and discuss with us what it means to vote for clean air, how air pollution affects children and their communities, and what voters should consider when evaluating candidates and policy proposals. Anne, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you.
I'm Ann Mellinger-Birdsong, and I'm a pediatrician and environmental health specialist. And this is all my contact information if you want to contact me afterwards. I always start out when I do testimony for either federal or state and say, children do not choose where they live, where they go to school, or whether the air they breathe is healthy or dirty. Adults make these decisions for them. We are responsible for making decisions that allow children to grow and thrive and be healthy. Children are more vulnerable to air pollution than adults for several reasons. They're smaller and they breathe more air for their body size than adults do. They're still growing in every organ, their brain, their heart and lungs, their liver, their arms and legs, every part of their body is still growing and forming all the way through the teenage years. They spend more time outside than adults do. And when they are outside, they're running and jumping and playing. They're not just sitting on a bench talking to their friends, but they're really active. So they get more exposure based on their physiology and their activities. And I'll just talk about a little bit of climate change because the same dirty fuels that are making air pollution are also causing our climate to change. And the American Medical Association, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American College of Physicians, and many other medical organizations all have policy statements about climate change and health. So their major kinds of air pollution are nitrogen dioxides, which comes from burning fuel in the air because the air is about 4 times as much nitrogen in it as oxygen. And anytime you heat up the air, no matter what you're burning, the nitrogen and oxygen also combine in a side reaction and make nitrogen oxides. We also have volatile organic compounds, which means volatile means they evaporate at room temperature, and organic means they have carbon in them. And there's, hundreds of kinds of these. They mostly come from fossil fuels and petrochemical plants. We have hazardous air pollutions, which include volatile organic compounds, but it also includes lead, mercury, arsenic, and other heavy metals. We have particle pollution, or particulate matter, and that is just small bits of usually carbon-based, but not always. You can see here this diesel particle is an electron microscope view of it, and this is 1 micron, which is 1/1,000,000th of a meter. It's really teeny. And there, that's 1 micron, and you got 50 of them. It's so teeny we can breathe it in our lungs, and it can cross straight into our blood and go everywhere in our body. And then this is another electron microscope, and I just put it in to show these bright spots are mercury that came in with the fuel, but it's a phosphorus plant, and the mercury attached to the particle coming out of the smokestack. So anybody who lived near this plant and breathed it in would also be inhaling mercury and perhaps absorbing some of it. And then we have ozone, which is not made directly from burning fuel, but it is a chemical reaction that happens in the air. We have oxygen and nitrogen oxides and volatile organic compounds, and they all get together in the air. And then the sunlight comes in and zaps them and gives them energy to make the chemical reaction go. And it goes faster when it's hotter. So that's why we all have ozone season in the summer, because the days are longer, the air is hotter, and the sunlight is more direct, straight overhead. So it makes the reaction happen more. And I always emphasize, where do the air pollution and climate change gases come from? People. And the same dirty fuels that are making air pollution that damages our health are also causing climate change. And then location does matter. Where you live, where you go to school, and where you work, where the playgrounds are, it really matters for kids. And this on the left here, it's an article in the Washington Post, and the link is down there so people can look at. But they went around San Francisco and Oakland and with a portable monitor and measured a bunch of different air pollution. And they found variations of 800% from one end of a block to the other. They found that communities of color had more exposure than white communities. And that matches with this other study here, which they measured in 2010, and then they spent a while analyzing it. It just got published a few years ago. But it's based on the redlining maps from 80 years earlier, from the 1930s. And those redlining maps drove the built environment, so that even now, 80 years later, we can see that the red areas have more air pollution than the green areas. And that's the legacy effect of that environmental racism of redlining. So here we get more into the health. So kids are affected by air pollution even before they're born, when they're still in the mother's womb, and it can cause low birth weight, premature birth, asthma, autism, and developmental delay. And we have real world examples of this. So in California, as a result of the Clean Air Act, the electric companies decided it was too expensive to keep the coal plants going, and they shut some of them down. And the rate of premature birth for people who lived within a mile or two of the coal plants went down from 7 to 5%. That's a 25% reduction. And again, a coal plant closed in China, and the rate of developmental delay in children who were in the womb and born after it closed compared to before. Before, there was a 15% rate of developmental delay, and after the coal plant closed, it went down to 5%. And then another real world example, when pregnant people in Mongolia used air filters, at age 4, they could measure a 3-point difference in the IQ between the ones whose moms had had an air filter and the ones who didn't. So that's a long-lasting effect from just prenatal exposure. We also know, obviously, air pollution is bad for lungs because, we breathe it in and it damages our lungs. And this is another real-world example of good policy after the Clean Air Act was updated and made much stronger in the 1990s. They measured different groups of children in Southern California, and those who were teenagers in 2010 had bigger lungs than those who were teenagers in 1998. And it was about a 10 or 12% difference. And this is more recent. 3 coal plants in Chicago closed, and they found a reduced ER visit for children's asthma of 12 to 18% for people living in zip codes near the coal plants. Then in Pittsburgh, a coal coking plant, which is a special kind of plant that makes coal extra potent that they use in the steel mills, one of them closed, and the rate of pediatric asthma visits for people living near that particular plant went down 40% because they're all really dirty. And then this one just came out last week. A group in Ohio replaced gas stoves with electric induction stoves. And it was both children and adults, but the rate of ER visits went down 70%. People use a third less rescue medicine, and there was far fewer work or school missed days, 78% less, just from replacing a gas stove in the home. So these are all policies that make us healthier. And that's why voting is so important, to choose people who would put in place policies that protect our health. This is more about school children and brains and mental health. So this was a study done here in Georgia where I live, and they put filters on diesel school buses, and they found that it improved both students' test scores and their aerobic tests, which they do in gym class. This graph is from children who moved from middle school to high school, and they were downwind from a highway. And you can see that if they were downwind from a big highway that had a lot of vehicle trips, 75,000 trips a day, their test scores went down compared to what they had had at their previous school. And then there's also the impact of air pollution on mental health. There are studies from Cincinnati, London, and Sweden that show more mental health problems from everyday exposure to air pollution or following spikes in air pollution. And then we also know about cancer. We know that diesel exhaust contains over 40 known carcinogens, and the IARC, the International Agency for Research on Cancer, classifies it as a known carcinogen, a carcinogenic substance. Refineries and chemical plants also release many kinds of hazardous air pollution. Studies in Pennsylvania near fracking show increased rates of children's leukemia and lymphoma for kids who live near fracking sites. Louisiana's Cancer Alley has lots, like over 100 petrochemical plants, and there are increased rates of cancer, respiratory disease, and newborn problems. And also in Colorado, near oil and gas development, we see increased rates of respiratory disease in children, and in adults, they're able to measure increased rates of cancer too. So that's kind of a big overview of why policy is so important, because air pollution comes from factories and cars and all kinds of things. And it's not just one thing that one person can control. And we need to elect people that will keep us healthy.
Absolutely. Thank you, Anne, for explaining all of that, and especially focusing on why clean air is so fundamental to children's health and how these air quality protections matter at the state, the local, and even the federal level. Air pollution obviously is one of the most important sources of environmental exposure, but children can also encounter harmful chemicals through the products they use, the food they eat, the water they drink, and even the places that they live and learn. Our next speaker, Mike Schade of Toxic Free Future, will discuss what it means to vote for a toxic-free economy. He's going to explain why preventing toxic exposures requires not only individual choices, but also stronger systems, safer products, and public policies that protect children and families. Mike, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much. Can you guys see my slides here?
Yes.
Great, thank you. For those of you that are not familiar with us, Toxic Free Future, we're a national environmental health research and advocacy organization. We've been around for 45 years, and we work to safeguard the public from exposure to dangerous chemicals and plastics that are harmful to our health, especially children's health. I myself have been working to safeguard communities from exposure to dangerous chemicals for 25 years, and I'm really excited to be here with you today. Thanks so much to NSA and the Children's Environmental Health Network for hosting this important conversation, especially during an election year. So a little housekeeping. I just want to note that we are a 501c3 nonprofit organization. So that means that we cannot endorse or oppose any candidates or political parties, and also that this presentation today is for educational purposes only, to inform voters and decision makers about issues that are relevant to our mission. So as we've heard from some of the other speakers over the years, we've learned that chemicals in everyday consumer products can harm communities and workers where they're manufactured. They also pose hazards to us as consumers when we bring these products into our homes, whether it's cosmetics or cleaning products or apparel. We too can be exposed to dangerous chemicals that can be harmful to our health. And of course, when we dispose of consumer products that contain chemicals of concern, like food packaging containing PFAS, for example, these chemicals can last forever in the environment. The packaging is used once, but the chemicals can last forever. So consumer products and packaging is an important source of exposure to chemicals that can be harmful to infants and young children and women of childbearing age. And as we've talked about so far today, we know that children and infants are uniquely vulnerable to exposure to chemicals. We've published several independent peer-reviewed studies in recent years that have documented that women's breast milk can be contaminated with some of the most toxic chemicals on the planet. Chemicals like PFAS, flame retardants, phthalates, bisphenols, chemicals that scientists will tell you can be dangerous even at very low levels of exposure. And we know that when infants and young children are exposed to chemicals during critical windows of development, when their bodies are developing, their brains are developing, this can pose lifelong health hazards. Unfortunately, as we've heard, exposure to certain chemicals have been linked to certain chronic diseases, several of which have been on the rise in recent decades. And I'm going to highlight a couple of examples. For one, we know that childhood cancer has been on the rise in recent decades. In fact, the incidence of childhood cancer has increased 35% in the last 50 years, and scientists are concerned that exposure to cancer-causing chemicals, for example, in consumer products, can be contributing to elevated rates of cancer that we see in children today. Of course, we also know that certain learning and developmental disabilities have become more common, including ADHD. Today, 1 in 6 children have developmental disabilities, and independent scientists have found that exposure to certain chemicals, such as phthalates, flame retardants, are contributing to increased incidences of certain learning and developmental challenges. Additionally, younger folks, and not just younger folks, but people today are having more difficulty getting pregnant and having children. Rates of infertility have risen quite significantly in recent decades by 84%. And scientists are sounding the alarm that exposure to certain endocrine disrupting chemicals like phthalates and bisphenols, for example, are contributing to rising rates of infertility. In fact, some of you may have seen the Netflix film that just came out a few months ago, Plastic Detox, which highlight how exposure to certain chemicals and plastics are contributing to elevated rates of infertility. And it's also worth noting that other neurological problems like Parkinson's disease have also been increasing. In fact, the number of people with Parkinson's disease has more than doubled in the last 30 years. And we know that exposure to certain chemicals like trichloroethylene, TCE, which is a chlorinated solvent found at many Superfund sites around the country, many brownfield sites, as well as PFAS have also been associated with Parkinson's disease. So I share all that to note that this is why elections matter. We need to be supporting policymakers who are prioritizing taking action on chemicals and plastics that are contributing to these elevated incidences of serious health problems that are on the rise here in the United States today. Here at Toxic Free Future, we are working with organizations around the country with one vision, which is that we need to ensure that the chemicals and materials that are manufactured here in the United States and around the world are designed to be safe for the health of people and the planet from the start. And we think that it's important for policymakers here in the United States to advance policies that are protecting children and infants and women of childbearing age from exposure to dangerous chemicals and plastics that are fueling an epidemic of diseases on the rise in our society. The good news is we know that there are policy solutions that are out there. Back in the early 2000s, scientists had documented that levels of toxic flame retardants were increasing and they were building up in people's bodies and people's breast milk. And then in the mid-2000s, there were several states across the country, including Washington, California, and New York, that had started to ban these chemicals in consumer products, in furniture, in children's toys and other consumer products, electronics. And as a result of those policies that were enacted by states coupled with voluntary decisions by leading businesses, we've seen that levels of toxic flame retardants, these brominated flame retardants, they've decreased significantly in our bodies. Between 2003 and 2019, levels of toxic flame retardants have declined by 70% in our bodies. And these are chemicals that were extremely toxic. They're kind of like PCBs. They can cause cancer and other serious health problems. So we have policy solutions that are out there. These problems are solvable, and that's why we need elected officials to come into office to advance policies to protect public health. We've developed a policy framework, what we call the Essential Elements for a Healthier Future, which is a policy framework that we think that can help decision makers advance laws in states at the federal level and even within corporate America that can solve this problem of toxic chemicals and plastics that are contributing to health problems on the rise. I'm not going to dive into this right now, but I encourage you to visit our website at toxicfreefuture.org to learn more. We know that voters today care about these issues. 92% of Americans feel that protecting clean air and safe drinking water should be treated as a top public health priority. In fact, nearly 90% of registered voters, 87% of registered voters, are concerned about the health hazards of chemicals that are commonly found in plastics all around us. Meanwhile, 88% of Americans are concerned about the health impacts of microplastics. And so we know that there is strong support for government protections from toxic chemicals. There's strong support from across the political spectrum. We need leaders who will put health first, to advance policies at the state and the federal level to reduce toxic exposures and to hold big polluters accountable. The good news is there are solutions in states. In recent years, there have been more than 400 state policies that have been adopted in 40 states across the country to regulate and restrict dangerous chemicals and plastics, whether it's PFAS in food packaging, or flame retardants in electronics, or phthalates in children's toys. And the good news also is that many of these laws that have been enacted across the country have been bipartisan in nature. In fact, many of these laws have been supported by Republicans in states all across the country. One example of a comprehensive law that's been enacted at the state level is a law that we got enacted in Washington State called Safer Products for Washington, which gives the state of Washington the authority to ban and regulate hazardous chemicals when safer alternatives are available. One example of that law in action, this past year, Washington State became the first state in the country to ban bisphenols in thermal receipt paper. Again, these are hormone-disrupting chemicals that we know are harmful to children's health. When we handle or touch thermal receipt paper, we as consumers can be exposed to significant quantities of bisphenols in thermal receipt paper. So that is an example of a health first policy that policymakers in Washington State enacted this last year that protect children and consumers from endocrine disrupting chemicals in consumer products. And at the same time, businesses have been stepping up as well. We recently surveyed major retailers, and we found that 21 out of 46 major retailers across the country have banned this entire class of bisphenols in thermal receipt paper. And several retailers, including Best Buy, Kroger, PetSmart, and Walgreens, have not only restricted these chemicals, but they have verified that they have switched to safer alternatives. So we know that solutions are available, and that's why we need to vote this November, and we need elected officials to come to office to advance policies to protect us from dangerous chemicals that are harmful to children's health. As I mentioned before, this is an issue that has broad support across the political spectrum. And voters not only want strong chemical safety laws enacted, but we also know that voters don't want federal standards to be rolled back. There was a poll that was done this past year by EDF, and they found that 74% of voters oppose weakening federal chemical safety standards. And they found that 57% of Republicans also oppose rolling back federal protections. So I want to thank all of you for joining today's webinar. I think, as you've heard from me and other folks, we need to get out the vote this November. These issues are extremely important if we're going to protect children from exposure to dangerous chemicals, whether they're in consumer products or whether they're in the air, as we heard from our previous speaker. And I'm going to put a link in the chat to a new resource that our organization helped develop, which is a candidate and voter guide that talks about the importance of toxics issues to voters and for elected officials and candidates. Thanks so much, and I look forward to the conversation. And I will put that
Thank you,
in the
Mike,
chat.
for helping us to understand the need to prevent that harmful chemical exposure, but especially before it occurs, and especially how to move towards safer products and systems. As we know, achieving that goal requires responsible industry practices, a lot of meaningful oversight, and especially accountability when businesses and corporations affect not only the workers, but the communities in which they serve. Our final speaker, Abre Conner of the NAACP, is going to go ahead and discuss what it means to vote for safer industry practices. And that's why industrial decisions can have, effects that are seen often downstream and in the very communities that show these disproportionate burdens. Keep in mind that voters should consider, especially safer industry practices and things like political appointees when they're deciding who to vote for at the ballot box. Abre, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be able to have this conversation with you all. And I am not going to repeat a lot of the information that you've already heard, but all of that is important to what we are talking about here when it comes to the decisions that are made every single day. Because who we vote for, that influences our elected and our appointed officials at the federal, at the state, and at the local level. So one of the things that I want to take a step back and discuss is just why permitting matters at all. Prior to there being many permitting, approvals and regulations and laws that existed in this country, we were facing more pollution than ever with no clear way to be able to have transparency or visibility into who was actually making those decisions. And many of the permitting decisions that we now see as laws were not partisan in nature. It was the recognition that our ability to have clean air, clean water, quality of life that, our children and our communities could be proud of were basic tenets in this country that we should all be working towards. And so the fossil fuels and contaminants that were actually just being widespreadly used across the country was something that we all recognized at that time needed to be reeled in. And so these permits are put in place to mitigate and in some instances prevent environmental harms. The problem, unfortunately, is that we are no longer dealing with a theoretical climate crisis. We are seeing the impact of decisions to have fossil fuels concentrated in communities in ways that our climate and our weather is showing us what exactly we are dealing with. I just left Chicago not too long ago, and the wildfires that were happening in Canada impacting the air quality of individuals who lived in Chicago or who were traveling to Chicago was a very real awakening, I think, for everybody who was there, and impacted how people were able to just interact with the community that they were going and traveling into. And that's just one example of how these decisions impact our everyday life. And so when you have, a federal administration that says that we are going to double down in ensuring that fossil fuels can be used widespread across the country and potentially to ensure that we're not a part of international discussions when it comes to us needing to roll back our fossil fuel use, those decisions matter. The federal landscape and what we've seen as it relates to permitting has changed drastically over just the last few years. I want to first start with a Supreme Court decision because oftentimes when we think about permitting, oftentimes what people think about is at the state and local level, and that's absolutely correct. We'll get there. But even our judges play a role in how permitting decisions impact our everyday lives. When the Sackett v. EPA case came out, it narrowed how the Environmental Protection Agency was able to look at wetlands processes across the country. And the Clean Water Act prohibits dumping of pollution into navigable waters. Now, what does that mean? That means that now, because the Supreme Court stepped in and basically made it harder for agencies to be able to regulate some of the decisions as it relates to water contamination, then that allows for there to be more pollution. And when we vote or don't vote across the entire ballot, then those decisions can then have impacts for years to come. And we actually saw a real life impact of the Sackett v. EPA decision recently in Indiana, where a data center was being built. And because of the Sackett decision, it was said that they weren't building that data center on a protected wetland, but it was a regulated wetland, and that we have thoughts about that definition. But when we vote, we have to think about how those decisions have long-term consequences to how we're able to do advocacy in the future. We're also seeing currently the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency try to roll back protections when it comes to having the public be a part of decision making for minor sources of pollution. Now, why I put that in quotes is because a majority of data center permits are coming through what is considered minor source permits. Even if we don't agree that they are indeed minor sources, the community is still able to offer their comments, engage in the decision making, to have transparency and visibility into those decisions. And the EPA is proposing a rule to cut back some of the public's ability to be able to engage in those processes, therefore allowing for industry to have more kind of free range into the decisions in states and localities, them having the opportunity to say whether or not the community and everyday people have to be involved in those projects. Now, that's important because we need to have as many layers of accountability as possible. We also have seen executive orders that have been put forth to fast track fossil fuel projects. And then at the state and at the local level, depending on where we are in the country, that many of those decisions are now being seen, the executive orders are being seen as law, even though we know that that's not the case. But that landscape is impacting what we're seeing in some places at the state and local level. We're also seeing that there have been governors who stood with this administration to say that they were going to fix ratepayer concerns as it relates to data centers. And that stance that the 23 governors took was not necessarily the stance that their actual communities asked for in many of those states. And in some of those places are some of the places where we've already seen some of the highest concentrations of pollution in sacrifice zones. So pollution going into places where there's already been disinvestment in those communities. We've already seen industries come in, not have decommissioning plans, not have a way to ensure that the community can benefit. And those were many of the states where they went and stood with this administration and had a very piecemeal, non-legally binding way to supposedly fix data center issues in their home states. And we also are seeing at the federal level for the first time, we are involved in a case in South Haven, Mississippi, where the Department of Justice has joined in a case to basically try to curtail everyday people's ability to hold polluters accountable through citizen suits. And citizen suits, when they were brought about at their inception with many environmental laws, was a bipartisan effort to ensure that everyday people were able to engage with the law. And so who we vote for matters, and it also is showing up in decisions that are happening across the country. Now, at the state and the local level, permitting decisions oftentimes show up in ways that maybe we may not even realize how it's going to impact decisions. So oftentimes there are environmental, state environmental quality agencies, but then sometimes at the county level, those are the agencies who are overseeing permitting decisions. And oftentimes, those agencies or a mayor or sometimes state elected officials, county elected officials, they might play a role in who actually sits on citizen boards to have the final say for air or other kind of permitting decisions. So who we vote for impacts how those types of permitting decisions and conversations go. Now, here's a very real example of how this impacted a case that we were working on. In Shelby County, the members of the Air Pollution Control Board, who oversee the decisions like allowing for XAI to operate in Memphis, they are appointed by the mayor at the county and at the city level, and then they are confirmed by the county commission in the city council. When we had our first hearing to appeal the fact that we believe that XAI operating in Memphis should not have been granted a minor source pollution permit and that they were obviously operating tons of pollution, that board said that they weren't really equipped to make that type of decision. And it was clear that there was concern regarding the fact that they were going to have to make this decision in the face of large companies who showed up in the community to potentially share their economic concerns regarding XAI operating. But that's not what they were there to do. That board is there for air permitting. So who we elect can have major impacts on everyday decisions, because if that board had actually moved forward with the appeal with an air permit in mind, we could have had a potentially completely different result as it related to our appeal. They seemed more concerned about, what the overall impact may be with the company there. But that's why we need to make sure that we have individuals who are in positions who understand the critical role of even some of these appointed roles as well. And then additionally, in Mississippi, the Mississippi Department of Environmental Quality and the Secretary of State allowed for a final ruling for a hearing for XAI to operate in South Haven on a hearing date that would fall on election day, over 200 miles away from where the data center was going to be operating. And the individuals who are typically in some of the most senior roles in these agencies are people who are appointed by the governor. And so these decisions matter for how a lot of everyday permitting decisions show up. And then the last thing I want to offer as an example is what we ended up having to get involved in Prince George's County. So in Prince George's County, the county council, they appointed a task force of individuals who are supposed to be looking at data center issues across the county. Unfortunately, the people who were appointed, for the most part, were all had vested interests and some potentially financial interest in ensuring that there was going to be rezoning to allow for more AI hyperscale data centers to go into the county, despite the fact that the task force was supposed to be ensuring that they were getting a true representation of the community. And when we saw what the recommendations were likely going to be, it was an opportunity for the NAACP to partner with other academic researchers to publish the People's Report that highlighted a counter narrative that unfortunately the elected officials and appointed officials should have been able to capture with the commission and the task force that they put in place. So, what are some of the things that you can do? Make sure that you are asking questions of elected officials and anyone who's running for office. Vote completely down the ballot and for every single position. And then last, don't assume that a certain role or position that it may not have overall role in permitting or zoning decisions, because oftentimes there may be some kind of role that is played that may not be obvious to us on the front end. Thank you.
Well, perfect. Thank you so much, Abre, and thank you again to all of our four speakers for sharing your expertise. Together, I think all four of these presentations really demonstrate that democracy, clean air, toxic chemical protections, and safer industry practices are closely connected. They're not just for independent tenants, they're all very, very interconnected and depend on one another. As we've seen, decisions in one can shape whether children have healthy places to live, work, and play, and the effects topple into all the others. We're now going to go ahead and begin our moderated question and answer session. As a reminder, all attendees can continue submitting questions through the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Our team is going to go ahead and keep reviewing all of your submissions, and I'll direct each question to the appropriate speaker. Depending on the question, I may also invite multiple speakers to participate. Okay. Looks like our first question we've got is for Nse. How can voters stay engaged in children's environmental health issues after Election Day?
Oh, it's a really good point. And again, thank you to all of our friends and partners here for their great points earlier. This never ends. Being a child health advocate never ends, is day to day. So where we show up, the spaces of influence, our community organizations, our civic organization, our school, childcare communities, all are prime opportunities, the places where we work to, have folks who have influence to take a step back, look at the policies that they administer, and to see where there could be some opportunities. For example, in childcare, there is a policy called a no idling policy that we encourage. It does not cost anything. It simply encourages discussions with the families who think that they're providing a good service on a very hot day by keeping it air flow going in a running car while they run in and pick up their child and maybe run back out. Same thing on a very cold day and keeping the heat on. The problem with that is that when you multiply that by 20, 30 cars a couple times a day times 5 or 6 days a week, that's a lot of air pollution right there at the beginning entryway of a childcare facility. And most childcare facilities have the infant rooms usually in the front of the room. So the most of the vulnerable of our children are right there. Most families, when they understand that, are very willing to just turn the ignition off and do what they need to do to safely pick up or drop off their child. So there are ways that many of us can assist and are happy to assist with low to no cost strategies that we've been seeing implemented across the country in wonderful, robust ways. And there are many other strategies that need a lot of support and funding and assistance. And by lending our voice, we have seen in history where the pendulum can swing. The loudest, if you will, can have results. Many of us do remember baby bottles being exclusively produced in plastic, BPA laden plastic. It was the growing, swelling community of those of us out here heating up water bottles on a daily basis that went to the baby bottle manufacturer and started putting pressure along with many child health advocates. So there's many examples of this. We have to continue to lend our voice. We have to continue to demonstrate that, if you will, better, safer, healthier strategies are available in many cases today. And we got to support our policy leaders in knowing that we are watching them and holding them accountable, that they were voted in to not destroy, but rather to uplift the health and well-being of all of their community, not just those who, if you will, populate their campaigns. I hope that helps a bit. Many of us would be happy to talk offline too about some strategy.
Yes, absolutely. And then I see we've got another question in the chat, and this is kind of comes in the recent storm of events with the current administration. Have any of our speakers been working with representatives from the Make America Healthy Again movement? And if so, how do you kind of approach those conversations in order to get people from all across the political spectrum to prioritize children's environmental health?
Anyone want to jump in there, or I'll just say real quick, I just think it comes down to human connection. I think there's a lot of narratives, accurate or not, about where people stand. And our friend Latricia Adams with Young, Gifted, and Green, if she was on, would remind us that there have been communities throughout our history, historically, time and time again, and still current to today, who have been, if you will, labeled without there being all the way justification for which. There are extreme perceptions in all kinds of different groups that make up our society. That is also the part of a democratic society. In my humble opinion, I think that I would encourage that we at least start exploring connection and at least communication, and then going from there. I suspect there will be some alignment with some parents who have a lot of concerns, and grandparents and folks who generally want to support the current and next generation. But how will we know until we engage? And then if there are points of dissension, then we call those out, and hopefully we can respectfully separate from those. But we're living in some times, right? And I just don't see how we can do all this in our related silos, starting with environmental health, public health. We need to continue to expand where reasonable, and try to find those alliances. We have a lot to give, and I believe that others out there have a lot to give as well. We got to find where those intersections are, would be my initial reaction. But I see Mike's hand up.
Yeah, I agree with all that. I think that was very well said. And, I definitely think that there's, areas where we would probably strongly disagree with, some of the leaders in the MAHA movement, but there's also a lot of areas where we do agree. And I think one of the areas where we do agree is that we need stronger state and federal protections and safeguards on toxic chemicals and plastics. We know that the MAHA leaders in the MAHA movement have been calling on the EPA to take action on chemicals like PFAS that are contaminating drinking water supplies. We know that there are folks in MAHA that don't want the federal government to roll back protections on toxic chemicals, pesticides, herbicides. So I think that there probably are opportunities where we can work together to raise our voices to ensure that the administration actually does what it said it would do, which was to make America healthy again. Sadly, that has not been the case over the last couple of years. Time and time again, we are seeing, various environmental regulations and laws being weakened or rolled back, and that's why we need to hold, as you were saying, and say, politicians' feet to the fire. Election day is one thing, but it's really the day after the election when the work really begins. And I think that there's a lot of opportunity after the election day this year to work with policymakers on both sides of the political aisle to, advocate for solutions to, children's environmental health issues that we're here talking about today. So, those are a couple thoughts that I would add to that.
The last thing I would add, and for us, I mean, we've been around for 117 years. And so we've seen a lot of different iterations of, political landscapes. And what we have realized, at our, kind of within our policy and legislative stature is that, oftentimes what really needs to be driving the conversation is what people are saying on the ground. And what we're seeing as it relates to, especially conversations around data centers, is that it is a nonpartisan level of opposition. And that if you're able to talk to constituents in these places around why policy solutions that they're asking for needs to be, brought to their elected officials, then that is a really important part of the strategy, because some of the conversations that are happening in DC are completely out of touch with what constituents actually want to see. And because this is, a conversation around voting and around the next wave of what we want our political landscape to look like, I think this is an opportunity for us to not necessarily just think about what we have now, but to talk about what we want to see, talk about the political landscape, the issue discussions that we want to see in the future, because that is what's going to allow for us to not have, such conversations that feel like it's leaning towards one particular group of people or the other, because there are issues right now that at the ground level, we're not seeing that level of partisan activity, and that everyday people are engaging in their localized democracy decision making and participating in everyday decisions because of the impacts of, for example, data centers in their communities.
Well, thank you, Nse, Mike, and Abre, for those answers. We had another one come in for the chat regarding the current political landscape. Do you see renewable energy playing a role, perhaps? And Anne, if you'd want to chime in on this one as well, how do you see renewable energy sources play a role in curtailing some of the effects, perhaps, of air pollution that we see?
Yeah, I'll just say any form of wind, water, or solar that doesn't make air pollution is really good for health, because every time we burn fossil fuel or biomass, we're making all this dangerous air pollution that damages our lungs and hearts and causes dementia and things in adults too. And so it definitely has a very big role.
Thank you. I had a quick question for Abre, and I think you touched on this a little bit in your previous answer. You were mentioning the issues that you all were brought in to help with regarding the XAI development issues in Memphis. How can members of various communities come together and capitalize on this kind of bipartisan support to prevent certain developments that might be damaging?
So I think that, and we're seeing this not just, we are seeing it in the South. We're seeing it in, urban, rural communities across the country. And I think it's about meeting people where they actually are right now. The conversations that people care about are whether or not a hyperscale data center is going to show up in their community, and whether or not it's going to change the overall landscape of how they're going to be able to have a good, or at least, where the quality of life is within their community at that moment. And if that is something that is important to everyday people in the community, that's where we need to start. We're just a couple of months out from November, and I think that, starting at a place of what is already resonating with everyday people allows for us to be able to start conversations around many other issues. When the data center conversation first kind of, was taking, when it first started to get legs, it was not as comprehensive of a conversation as what we're seeing now. And so there is an opportunity to talk about air pollution. There is an opportunity to talk about water issues that may already exist and are going to be exacerbated. Of course, we're seeing the impacts of energy in the grid, or if they bring their own turbines in, and we're seeing noise and other quality of life concerns. And so many of the topics that we talked about here today would fit into conversations that we're seeing as a part of, these dinner table, kitchen table talks that people are having already. And so it's really about figuring out like in land and zoning, because definitely in certain parts of the country, that's a huge part of the discussion. And so it's figuring out what is it that's already resonating and then using that as an opportunity to explain up and down why the entire ballot matters. Because we do polling, and we also look at how people are voting at the NAACP. And unfortunately, there are times where people vote for the positions that they think are going to have the most impacts on their everyday, life. But the truth is, every single decision, every single person who is running for an office, that all matters in the conversation that we're having here today. And so we just need to make sure that we are reiterating that in as many places and in as many ways as possible.
Absolutely. And I think that goes back to what Mike touched on regarding just bringing in people from all across the political spectrum and finding that common ground to really put children and put environmental health first. With that, I know we were not able to get to every question that we had today, but we really appreciate your engagement and encourage you to keep using the Vote for Kids resources and to start those conversations in your own communities. We're now going to take a couple minutes and walk through the second half of the resources, including the voter guide toolkit. So the purpose of the toolkit is really to make it easy for individuals and organizations to share accurate, nonpartisan information about the issues that are affecting children's environmental health and how to kind of take what we've discussed today and turn it into action for the midterms. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and begin sharing my screen and begin a brief presentation. All right, so this is our companion toolkit in the PDF form, and this is available on our Children's Environmental Health Network website. It is, again, C3 compliant and completely nonpartisan. So individuals, you can take this into your communities, you can share it with organizations, and you don't have to worry about kind of towing that line or crossing any lines, whether that be one side of the aisle or the other. So you'll see here's our title page, and we're going to go ahead and move into page 2. And it begins with really a brief guide of how to get ready to vote. This includes confirming your eligibility and registration status, checking your state's deadlines and identification requirements, deciding how you plan to vote, as well as confirming your polling location. There's a lot of work that actually goes into voting before you reach the ballot box. So we've got resources linked in here about how to make sure that you're honestly good to go before you show up, because you just really want to avoid any hiccups. We're going to go ahead and begin, and you can see confirm your eligibility. You can go ahead and register to vote. And then on the website, these are clickable links, so it's very easy for individuals with access to technology. And we're also happy to email or share this resource around with you if you're having difficulty finding it online. You're going to see the rest of our steps here. And then as we move on to page 5, you can see the steps that we're kind of advising that you take when you begin identifying candidates and policy issues. So first, you can identify the candidates who are going to appear on your ballot using a few of these tools that we've listed below. So you see we have Ballotpedia, Vote 411, as well as vote.gov. Once you know who's running, the toolkit really easily walks you through how to evaluate each candidate. It recommends looking really beyond campaign messaging and reviewing 4 main categories of information. And that's what we're going to touch on in step 2. So as you can see, we focus all about how to evaluate your candidates. You're going to get 4 very actionable steps: reviewing their voting records, reviewing bills sponsored or co-sponsored, reviewing their public statements and policy platforms, and finally reviewing their campaign funding and industry ties. Because as we know, a candidate can get up and say one thing or post one thing on their website, but depending on who they're accepting money from, their loyalties may lie elsewhere. So as you can see, as we begin to scroll down, we're going to start with their voting record. The legislation that they've sponsored or co-sponsored is included in here, as well as their public statements and things like that. Again, you've got resources right down here on congress.gov, GovTrack, and then our friends at League of Conservation Voters. And you can click on any of these links and go and visit their sites very easily. Down in this green box, we've got what you should really look out for. And that's things like votes on Clean Air Act protections, Clean Water Act protections, things like PFAS regulations that has been in the news very recently. As we move on, you can see that we've also got resources for state and local candidates. So this isn't just about the federal elections. As Abre touched on, it's important at every level because a lot of the individuals who are making the decisions that are impacting the environmental health of communities are actually those local governing boards. So you want to make sure that you're participating and that you're casting an educated vote in those elections as well. You can see here that deciding to sponsor or co-sponsor bills really signals a politician's policy priorities. So again, they may be posting one thing on their website, but then when they actually go and vote on a specific piece of legislation, the vote may go one way or another, and that can kind of help to clear things up as to where they really stand. We've got very actionable steps again on once you reach a website such as Congress.gov, how do you go in and find an individual member? How do you find the legislation that they're sponsoring or co-sponsoring? And you can also select relevant tags like health, environmental protection, energy, public lands, or natural resources. And that can kind of help filter the bills that they've brought about. Finally, we've got some questions that you can ask yourself here at the bottom, such as, do they support funding for regulatory enforcement? Have they introduced legislation to protect children's environmental health? Keeping track of those answers in your head or on a piece of paper can help you to differentiate between two or three candidates that you might be between. Again, you can see reviewing public statements and policy platforms can be extremely helpful. Oftentimes, they will be upfront about what they're saying, and it's a good way to see very quickly and very easily where a prospective political appointee or someone that you're voting for may stand on a particular environmental health issue. But again, paying attention to this disclaimer at the bottom of the page, be sure to distinguish between general rhetoric and specific policy commitments. So an individual may say that, they want to care about the environment or they've got very strong feelings towards clean water or clean air. But if they're not able to comment on specific pieces of legislation or if they're hesitant, that's something to keep an eye out for. Finally, something that kind of flies under the radar until recently, reviewing campaign funding and industry ties. So as we know, campaign funding can really provide insight into relationships with industry or advocacy groups that a particular candidate may have. We've got two really clickable links here. For the first of which is Open Secrets, and that is a website that publishes campaign finance data for federal and state candidates. And then second, right after that, we've got the FEC's campaign finance data website. That one's a little bit more in-depth and it can require a little bit of advanced math knowledge to figure out who and what people are getting sources from where. So that Open Secrets is a great place to visit. You can review things like the top industry donors, any contributions from fossil fuel, chemical, or pesticide industries, as well as contributions from public health or environmental groups. So this step is kind of intentionally placed right after reviewing their public statements and their voting behavior because you can see, does the money really add up with these things? And oftentimes it will. And again, make sure that you're cautious of things like social media claims without citation or statements that conflict with voting history. These can be really big red flags as you're evaluating candidates. Finally, we've got options to create a sample ballot. So Ballotpedia has a fantastic resource, as does vote.org. And then we've also linked a Google Doc version of this page that you can easily fill out as you're evaluating candidates. So again, these are very actionable items for potential voters and anyone interested in taking part in this democratic process to go ahead and follow. Finally, we've kind of got an issue by issue research guide that goes over each of our 8 key tenets of the voter guide in detail. It gives you ideas for research questions that you can go ahead and pop into your favorite search engine. For example, the candidate's name and voting rights, executive power, election transparency, and you can see exactly where they might stand on each of the issues that we've touched on today. Again, be cautious of things like op-eds in newspapers or quotes that are taken out of context and things like that as you're beginning to evaluate candidates. Finally, at the very end, we've got our resources, references, and links section. If you get lost, this is a great place to go, or if you already kind of know what you're looking for, this is a fantastic resource to use and to send out to your communities and put it really in the hands of the people who are going to make a difference. And finally, our candidate evaluation sheet. You can feel free to print this off or create a digitally editable copy. You can evaluate on a 5-star rating for each of the different 8 tenets of the voter guide. And then finally, we've got our sample ballot and checklist. So feel free to send us an email. This is also available on our website at cehn.org/vote4kids. And I'm going to go ahead and stop the screen share so that we can get NSA together for some final words and a call to action.
Thank you, Garrett. You're an excellent facilitator. We'll have to try this again. No, just a huge thank you for everyone for hanging in there. As you see, this is a lot of, hopefully you find important information. We've got a couple calls to action, right? Or this would be a meaningless discussion. Number one, please vote. I don't think it's going to be a problem for any of you, but please do whatever you can to encourage those, your loved ones, your colleagues to vote. We could have a whole dissertation on how important that simple activity is and what it has meant to those who have lost their lives before us so that we can exercise that opportunity. Please share the voter guide, the tools, the toolkit, the resources. They're available for all of our use. Again, this is an intended resource for us as individual voters, but also the campaigns that we're looking at. And hopefully campaigns will get on the record on their websites or in town halls. And please don't assume that we know who all those people are. So as you see some candidates in your local areas that start to stand up as child health champions or actually start to articulate what their administration would be or their time in office would look like if they're given the opportunity to serve. We'd love to hear that because that coalesces right well with Children's Environmental Health Day, which is October 8th. And obviously just a couple of weeks before, for example, the midterms are one leverage point, but every local election all the way through to federal, national elections are applicable for use of these resources. Please stay in touch with us, give us feedback as you're utilizing these tools and resources. We'd love to hear from you. And just a reminder that this is, again, for all forms of government. And as Mike was saying in his earlier disclaimer, this is C3 work. I think there's been some confusion as to whether this is C4 work. Any and all nonprofits, we are not telling folks again how to vote, who to vote for. We are trying to, as we have with all previous voter guides, encourage that children's environmental health and the multiple array of aligning issues that again coalesce with so much of what the majority of the U.S. public is looking for becomes and continues to be a strong factor, along with very important additional aligning factors as people are making their serious votes for who to then lead in their communities and beyond. And with that, just a huge thanks to all of you. Please be well, be safe, and let us know how any of us can assist you offline as you continue to do the wonderful work that you do with much appreciation.